Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of our Symposium Adaptation and the Australian Novel. Welcome back to those of you from yesterday, and welcome for the first time for those of you who might be joining us afresh just to listen to this conversation with Andrew Bovell and Dan Giovannoni, who I will introduce very shortly. I'm Stephen Carlton, Director of the Centre for Critical and Creative Writing here at UQ, and I would like to commence by acknowledging the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we all gather here for us in Brisbane, Meanjin. On behalf of the Centre, I do pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. And I extend my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us throughout the symposium. Okay, introductions. Andrew Bovell is a fixture in the firmament of contemporary Australian stage and screenwriting. I love Andrew's plays and I look forward to the experiment with form and content that I know is going to come with each one of his new works. I kind of think of him as our Carol Churchill in that regard, a constant innovator. His plays have become canonical. Writers and audiences love the literary puzzles and the studies in national and personal psyche that are Speaking in Tongues, When the Rain Stops Falling, Holy Day, and Things I Know to Be True. His adaptation of that first play into the film Lantana has quickly become an Australian classic. And on a personal note, Andrew, I want to say what a wonderfully generous and authentic mentor and champion for other Australian playwrights you are. Dan Giovannoni is a rising star in Australian theatre. I became aware of Dan's influence and his talent by my roles on various Australia Council funding panels, so I kind of knew about you already, Dan, before I'd encountered your work, where the esteem with which he was held by his peers was abundantly clear. He smashed out of the blocks of the indie scene via his work for young audiences with touring classics like Cut Snake and Wrecking, and also via his work with Melbourne-based collective Little Ones Theatre, where Dan has also adapted Christos Cholz's, or several of the stories in his queer urban short works collection, Merciless Gods. Andrew Bovell and Dan Giovannoni, welcome.
Hello. Hey.
We might just kick off, and I should tell people at home that we will open questions up to you as well, and feel free to type those into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your questions to Andrew and Dan whenever you're ready to kind of fire them away. I'm just wondering if we could begin, though, with each of you talking us through the material circumstances that you came to find yourself with this gig of adapting this most iconic and challenging of novels for the stage and screen. Maybe, Andrew, if we begin with you. You and Christos had worked together with Melbourne Workers Theatre, right, on Who's Afraid of the Working Class. Was that relationship the conduit to this project?
No, other way around, really. I came to Loaded via the director, Anna Kokkinos, who invited me to join her in adapting the book. Late 90s, mid to late 90s. So we're talking 20 years ago, which is pretty horrifying. But so interesting that 20 years later, there's an artist like Dan who's still kind of, finding enormous relevance in the material. But yeah, so essentially a relationship was brokered between Anna and I. She's very cautious about who she works with. So she took a long time kind of auditioning me, and that form of audition really just took the form of talking about the book, about Melbourne, about life, and getting to know one another. And finally, I won the gig. But it was through working on the film that I got to know Christos, and then later worked with him.
Oh, okay, great. That's really interesting to know. I had no idea that it worked around the other way there. And Dan, you'd obviously worked with Christos and director Stephen Nicolazzo before. You had, as I mentioned, you'd adapted Merciless Gods to the stage, right? I imagine the relationship began there?
Yeah, so I had known Stephen for many, many years, and yes, we had previously adapted Merciless Gods, which Christos wasn't kind of directly involved in the adaptation, but was a touchstone for us, throughout. We talked to him I talked to him a lot through the process of adapting those stories. And then Loaded sort of arrived, I guess, in a similar way. I think director Stephen Nicolazzo had been looking for a new Christos to adapt, a new novel of work of Christos's to adapt. And I think sort of at the same time, Christos had been thinking himself about revisiting that character. And so the character of Ari from Loaded. And there was a period where we sort of didn't know what the adaptation would be. Christos thought that perhaps he would adapt it himself. And then there was a moment where perhaps I would just adapt it. And then we sort of decided to do it together. Here we are.
There were a few comments yesterday and questions, a little bit of speculation about what Christos is like in terms of handing his work over, and maybe others can raise that earlier on. But can you just talk to us about that relationship that you had with him with this project then? So the Malthouse website describes it as a collaboration, between the two of you. How did that collaboration work logistically and even spiritually speaking?
It started with a lot of conversation, and we knew each other from Merciless Gods. So I think there was a trust and a respect that had sort of already been, the foundation had already been laid. We didn't really know what it was going to be before we started. There were no sort of initial conversations where it's like, okay, we're going to adapt it together. And I've worked with other writers before on things, adaptations and original works, and so sort of had a sense of how it might go. Those other writers that I've worked with have always been like very, very close friends. Definitely not writers of international significance. And so I was a little bit, was I worried, scared, all of the above, about what it would mean to work with someone on their work. Loaded is, the novel is broken into 4 chapters, really 4 sections that sort of chart the character's odyssey across Melbourne. It's broken into north, south, east, and west. And pretty early on, we decided that we would each tackle 2 sections, and then swap and kind of do a pass of each other's writing as well. And though that was, again, frightening, having a crack at somebody else's writing, going over Christos's work.
Yes.
It was
telling him it's not quite right.
It was just a deepening of my understanding of that character. And I think for him too, we sort of got clues from each other's work. I think at the beginning, that first draft, it really was one writer does one half and another writer does another half. And as the drafts sort of evolved, that it became harder to see where that line was between our 2 bits.
Should we? Well, let's while we're inside that project, then let's begin by talking about the stage adaptation. And Andrew will be back with you shortly to talk about the film adaptation process. I guess so. Well, two things jump out to me straight away. I mean, firstly, you're reconceiving the novel as a one-person show. In theatrical terms, it's a one-person show. But then also you've got this other adaptation, right, where you have to adapt to circumstances of the global pandemic as much as you're having to adapt to the medium. The stage play was originally scheduled in the final 2020 slot, and then you had to pivot to the digital world and reconceive the performance as an audio experience. Can you talk us through that process?
Yeah, when that happened, when there was sort of, when the pandemic hit, I suppose, I was in the middle of lots of conversations about pivoting and about how the works that were kind of stalled could have another life. And there were conversations on other projects about live stream performances, and all of those things felt like not icky, but a compromise, I suppose, like a way of working through a time when we couldn't work. And then Stephen suggested that we turn the stage show into an audio experience. And Christos and I both had our gut reactions were really positive. They were sort of, it felt dramaturgically sound, actually, to have this character, this solo character who, you know, would be in your ears, charting his journey across this city. You know, that music is such a big part of Ari's of the way that Ari experiences the world in the novel, and we kind of thought of this as his ultimate mixtape, you know? And so the chance to have those two characters, Ari and music, together in a really clean way, felt right and felt great. We didn't kind of, we didn't run from that.
Yeah, it felt neat. It felt natural, I have to say, that medium when I was listening to it as well. As well as the medium adaptation, I guess, Dan, the most significant textual opportunity that was provided to you and Christos was the opportunity to reimagine the text for the 21st century, right? That's a big adaptational interpretation of the novel. Ari is still a 19-year-old boy wanting to be neither Greek nor gay, but he's a 19-year-old boy in 2021 rather than the 1990s. So there's a whole stack of cultural considerations there that suddenly have to shift. You know, the music you talk about as being a character, they're the obvious ones, aren't they? I thought there was this neat, like it was like his musical tastes from the original novel had kind of become his mum's a little bit, like she's a Temptation fan. Can you describe the adaptation challenges there and opportunities on that front, I guess?
Some of the early conversations we had were about what kind of adaptation this would be. And I suppose the three options that were on the table were to do a relatively faithful adaptation set in the mid-90s. As I said earlier, Christos had always been interested in revisiting that character, Ari. And so we talked about what it would mean to sort of do him now as a 40-something-year-old man in 2020. But pretty quickly we decided that I think when I went back to read the novel in advance of our first development, maybe it was like 10 pages in before I was like, oh, it's 1996. And that was really interesting for me because I was like, up until then, it all felt like it could be now. The things that this kid is talking about, the way that he moves through the city, the conversations he's having with his drug dealer, the conversations that he could be having in 2020, 2021. And so, yeah, that was a pretty early, we decided pretty early that it would be him now. And yes, as you say, music's a big one. The geography of the city has changed, sort of you know, in the novel, he's on the dole and he still manages to have these wild nights out with huge quantities of speed going up his nose, and that's not really possible now on the dole. So all of those things were considerations. And, you know, this kid from a working class family living in Richmond, Richmond is a different place now. And so, yeah, those were all important conversations or big conversations that we had at the start. And I think I was more worried about it at the beginning, but as we sort of went through it, I was like, actually, once we've sort of found that we didn't have to make that many or find that many solutions for those problems. They were quite clean, and from my perspective, didn't feel sort of so convenient that it undermined that character.
Yeah, great. I imagine that's a lot of what you're bringing to it as well, as someone 20 years younger than Christos, right, or thereabouts. Andrew, let's chat to you then. So for you, the task is a more traditional adaptation in that sense. It's it was an accurate spirit of Christos's novel that you were capturing for the screen. Do you want to talk us through the choices, the process you went through, and how much of that, you've spoken about it being a very close relationship with Anna Kokinos as well. How collaborative was the writing process with the director there?
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing to comment on is that same question you put to Dan, which what was Christos like to work with? I mean, this was the first time his work was being adapted into another medium, as far as I know, and he approached it with great generosity, absolutely allowing Anna and I enormous space to find our own response to the material. But he's also a cinephile. And as Dan said, has an enormous knowledge about music. So he brought great enthusiasm and really interesting reference points that he wanted us to look at, so that as a way of maybe conveying how he saw it without kind of saying, this is how you should do it. He had great respect for Anna and her film Only the Brave. They shared a Greek heritage, of course. That they shared an understanding of what it meant to grow up second generation Greek. So there was a language there that they shared, and a trust that came out of that. The process between Anna and I, we're both perfectionists. So we drove that material hard, and we wrote and we wrote and we wrote and we wrote, and it was never kind of good enough. And that was incredibly frustrating at times, not just for each other, but for ourselves. I guess we had really high aspirations. We were enormous fans of the novel. We felt a great deal of responsibility to the story. We related to it. It was a portrait of our city at our time. We were both moving through that same geography that Ari moved through, doing similar things, if not all the things that Ari was. So we wanted to get it right. But, when you're in cinema, it is primarily a director's medium. A director is going to be the person that will take that material forward and realize the film. So my task, and I was pretty raw as a screenwriter there. I'd come off one early film experience, Strictly Ballroom, working with Baz Luhrmann, who could not be a more different director than Anna Kokinos. But, so I was kind of like, serving her vision. And that took a long time to find. At some points, like the geography, for instance, was one of my favorite elements of the book. The 4 points of the compass as a structure. I'm a structuralist in the first place, so I love things that present a shape, an inherent shape. So I wanted to emulate that in the film, but eventually that kind of the demands of a screenplay, of the need for forward momentum, for plot, somehow at some point overrode that beautiful design. But, in the end, I think we had to accept that it was a literary conceit, perfectly suited for the book, but we needed, in order to find our version of the film, to step away from it.
The film generated controversy because of its explicit depiction of sex. Alex Dimitriades' famous masturbation scene. The novel is even more graphic than that, really. It's pretty, confronting. You must have felt a responsibility for the film to be as frank as the novel, that to enter into the spirit of it and to kind of honour it. But I imagine you're also aware of the challenge that's going to present to film classification boards and, conservative cultural critics. What was that process of negotiation like?
We were excited about the sexuality. We were excited about what it represented, its frankness, its honesty. And so we wanted to absolutely have it in the film, and we didn't want to be somehow coy or discreet. But of course, that's a very delicate negotiation with the actor. And full credit to Alex Dimitriades, who had the courage to go there. So we wanted to meet the sexuality head on, and to be really upfront with it. We would have liked to have gone further from memory, But yeah, we had to work within a kind of moralistic framework about what was appropriate and what was not. And certainly the erect penis was problematic for a whole lot of people. And the double standards around that have been challenged in terms of how the female body is used in film and how the male body is used. So, we wanted to challenge that, push those boundaries. I remember great conversations about cocks and how they would be shown and represented in the film. But also how the anonymous sex would be treated, because there is so much kind of maybe fear or uncertainty or moral condemnation of whatever that represents to people. So most people aren't walking down the back lanes of Melbourne looking for head jobs, but we could take an audience there into that kind of prohibited space. And I think the film did that in a really interesting way. It didn't make fun of it. It didn't even necessarily, quite often that kind of sexual practice is revealed in film in a way that's sort of humiliating to somebody participating in it. And I don't think that it was in that film. It was sort of, it was intense and it was satisfying for everybody involved. So look, the representation of Ari's sexuality is so central to the book and so central to the film. And we worked very hard to get it right within the confines of the censorship and classification of the time.
Thank you. Dan, how about for you? How does that same range of considerations operate differently or similarly in the theatre? And I guess a follow-up, what made the novel confronting or controversial 20 years ago? Is it differently controversial today? And I guess I'm talking about the way that you're dancing around language, identity politics differently in the 21st century than in the 90s.
Yeah, look, I get asked, because having adapted Merciless Gods, I get asked about, I guess, the controversy or the brutality of Christos's work a bit. And yeah, perhaps that was sort of the first time I read Merciless Gods, for example. I was like, "Poor, this is full on." But actually, there's just an honesty in Christos's characters, and Ari is really honest about the way that he has sex and the kind of sex that he likes, and the sex in the book speaks to his character. He has the kind of sex that frees him from the constraints of his upbringing. He has the kind of sex that he needs to liberate himself from that shadow that hangs over him. And so in that way, the sex always kind of, I don't know, was part of his character. And so the way that we described the sex he was having felt honest and true to his character. I did read the maybe it was the third draft or something, and the first thing that Christos and I said to each other after we had read it was, "There's a lot of sex in there," and so I suppose there was a process of us trying to pick our sex moments, in a 80-minute monologue. There's only so many times you can watch someone or hear about someone having sex, and so we were kind of more selective about those moments in our adaptation. There are certainly more sex encounters in the novel. Yeah. So what was the second part of your question, Stephen? Sorry.
Oh, well, how is your version? How's your 21st century version of the text freshly controversial, I guess? I think, Ari is pretty politically incorrect, right? And I'm just wondering if that challenges your hipster inner city audience, his kind of cavalier or disparaging kind of, way of referring to people of different ethnic backgrounds. and to, you know, the gender fluids. I think he refers to a bunch of people, you know, at the dance party. So, you know, are you exploring fresh controversies inherent in the novel there?
I guess so. I guess we did talk about. I was probably a bit more nervous about some of that stuff than Christos. Christos is a braver writer than I think. But yes, there were conversations that we had. Again, I think it was never gratuitous. You know, we didn't have conversations about like what can we get away with. It's really about like who is this person, this young kid stomping through the city, and the people that he encounters and his upbringing. How do all those things collide on this one night, you know, under the influence of this many substances? He, you know, I think that in the novel definitely, and perhaps to a lesser extent in the audio adaptation, class is really a kind of the forefront of some of that railing. And I think contemporary identity politics don't necessarily kind of fold class in the same way. And so there was a little bit of dancing there too, to sort of try and I don't know, massage those two things together in his mouth.
Yeah, I enjoyed those conversations that the text had, that, you know, I guess that you guys have inserted there about class. I couldn't remember whether they were there. I didn't reread the novel as prep, I have to confess. So I'm going from memory to memory of the film. How did those class negotiations, obviously, Andrew, they became big ones in your subsequent work with Christos. How did they play out in the film adaptation?
Yeah, look, class has been, I think, the theme that Christos and I have shared, along with Patricia Cornelius and Melissa Reeves and Irene Vella, in that collaboration, in that ensemble of voices. Everything is about class for us. It certainly was in the play Who's Afraid of the Working Class, and we tried to revisit that in the play Anthem. So in Loaded, it was very clear. You know, Ari is from migrant class, so there is a kind of intersection, if you like, between working class and migrant class, and his identity, along with his sexuality, kind of, you know, represents all those complexities. So he wears that heavily, I think, on his shoulders, as he does all his identities. And his struggle as a character is to somehow separate himself from whatever anybody thinks he should be, whether that be his parents, whether that be a gay community, whether that be some notion of that he belongs anywhere in terms of a class identity. He certainly wasn't conscious or trying to fit within that framework. He was busting all those kind of definitions, busting through them. You know, for me, the film is so much about, you know, it's a portrait of defiance, and he defies any sense of labeling. He even stands in defiance against the notion that somehow love will save him, in his rejection of that connection with the guy he meets on that night. And there's such courage and bravery in that. And I know at the very end of the film, and we struggled to end that film in a way that felt complete, but he stands there and he says, you know, something about, you know, nobody's going to remember me when I'm dead. And somehow there was such a kind of bravery and freedom in that I loved the character. Especially now, I kind of think we seem so kind of preoccupied with having to be remembered or having to be of significance in this world. And for Ari to stand there and dance on the very wharf that his ancestors arrived on, in defiance of that history, felt kind of very powerful at the time.
For sure. it's time to open the floor to questions from our attendees from home. So please, participants, feel free to type your questions into the Q&A function, and I will happily pass those on to Andrew and to Dan as they appear. Maybe while I'm giving people time to just organise their thoughts and get some questions in, maybe if each of you could, I think you've touched on this kind of implicitly there, you know, each of your own relationships with Melbourne, with Ari's Melbourne and with the novel. But could you just each expand a little more, if you're happy to do so, to talk us through your encounter with the text from the position of your respective cultural identities, however you might want to define or discuss those. I imagine that you each have very different relationships with the novel because of who you are. Andrew, you're on screen. Do you want to start?
Well, you know, at the time, you know, I was married. I still am married to the same person who is Greek. I'd married in a Greek Orthodox church. So I'd married into that family or a version of it. I was an outsider, but I kind of was enmeshed in the expectations of migrant parents and how the second generation carried those. I was also a father, either of one or two kids. I can't remember, maybe, or maybe three. No, I was three children, yes, because Eugenia, my partner, was in the film. And I was bringing our youngest kid onto set for her to breastfeed through the process. So, you know, I was everything that Ari wasn't, in a way. A straight man, a straight family man with kids, Anglo-Saxon. But, you know, what I was, what I brought to the table is a love of good storytelling, and a kind of a sort of sense of being able to organize material in an effective way to tell a good story. So, you know, I felt like I could bring that to the table. But certainly, you know, I moved to Melbourne in my young 20s. It was a discovery from Perth, from a, you know, very provincial city. And I stepped into that place with an appetite for life and everything I could possibly experience at that time. And I did experience it all in my young 20s. I was at drama school, and I did a lot of good things that you should do in your early 20s. So I was coming off a sort of recent history of moving in the similar worlds to Ari and Christos. So it wasn't completely unfamiliar world to me.
Thank you. Thank you for your candor there as well. Dan, what about you and your relationship, your cultural relationship with the novel, I guess?
Yeah, it looks similar, really. I mean, I am the grandchild of migrants. My Italian grandparents came here in the 50s. So I'm not Greek, but I guess we are both, you know, the descendants of migrants, walking the same streets. Obviously, you know, walking those streets 20 years later, and I guess a generation after Ari, in the sense that my parents were born here, and so the shadow of that migration is a little you know, less present, I think, on me than it is on Ari. But yeah, similarly, I as I was writing it, was myself, I guess, transitioning out of my Ari phase of life. I was also just married and had just had a child, but was still very much sort of, I guess, in my hard partying days running around the city were just there. And so I guess I connected in almost a nostalgic way with this kid's romp. And whilst I don't think I personally had the same sort of ferocity as Ari, particularly in terms of kind of the way that he rages against the world, the pressures that are on him, I definitely felt on myself as well. in terms of sort of reconciling how to kind of be gay and a wog and a man at the same time. So all of those things felt very true, and were kind of my in really to that character. And I suppose Christos and I guess filled in different parts of 21st century Ari's personality, and he brought sort of more of the working class anger, I guess, than I did. But I think I filled in some other stuff that yes, perhaps because of my age, was easier for me to access.
It's, as you're both speaking there about what you bring to the novel and how you read Ari, I'm thinking that for all three of you, and I'm including Christos in there, it seems like Ari is this kind of the writing of him and of each of your versions of the text seems to be a writing out, you know, of your own rite of passage through your 20s and into some kind of I don't know, integrated kind of post-20s adulthood. It's is there a, you know, I don't know, a therapeutic kind of component to that? And do you imagine that there was for Christos? I'm asking you a ghosted question there, I suppose, a vicarious question.
Yeah, I mean, Christos, he speaks quite openly about that Ari is, you know, Ari's not him, but Ari has a lot of him in him. And I guess I felt the same. This character is not me, and we have, you know, our lives are so different in so many ways. But I think that we both escaped in the same ways. And you know, it was, I guess that was a really I don't have many intergenerational queer relationships, and so getting to know Christos through this process was really illuminating for me. I suppose being able to talk to another gay man 20 years my senior who thought the same things that I did when he was 20, and yeah, there was a neither of us kind of, I think in the audio adaptation, claim him as closer to ourselves, but listening to it back, it feels like something that is a fusion of both of our experiences or something.
No, that's interesting, and I can see that from the outside in the text. I think, and it's to do with that temporal adaptation. You know, it's an interesting decision to have made, to have kind of bumped it up by 20 years as well. Andrew, what about you?
I was just going to say, like, for me, Loaded, I don't particularly feel confident in speaking for him, but Loaded seemed like a farewell to something, a farewell to youth. So when I met Christos, he was in an incredibly stable relationship with Wayne, his partner, which remains, you know, the most important thing in his life, and he's the portrait of stability, and not Ari-like at all in that sense. But so it felt like, a fond farewell to a time of life. But, you know, you can't write that until maybe it's over or you're through it. And I always kind of say, you know, write it to write, you slightly need to be outside of an experience and looking in, observing. So I don't know if Ari could have written that book. You needed to be with Ari on the journey, watching him. You needed to be his best friend to kind of capture it. So I know he carries a lot of his spirit in that character, but I know he's also it's come from being an older man looking back.
Great. I have a kind of a concluding question for each of you, but I'm still keen to hear from people at home. Don't be shy. We have a question from the room, though. Thank you, Chris, very much. A question for Dan. How does making an audio play, do you think, how will that influence your playwriting practice going forward?
Having written an audio play, we didn't do heaps of rewriting between the stage adaptation and the audio adaptation. I guess maybe as much as we would have done in rehearsals. It's so difficult to know because I'd never worked with neither. I don't know if Christos has ever worked in audio before, but I hadn't written something like this before. And it felt like such a logical fit that it's sort of difficult to get perspective on it.
Did it feel closer? Sorry to interrupt you. Did the audio process, did it feel closer to the novel than to the stage? In a way, it felt like a new Ari, reading the novel to me, and I had to keep reminding myself that this was meant to be in the theatre.
I have to say, listening to the audio work, I mean, we talked a lot about what this was going to be on stage, what is it to watch one person run around on a bricks and mortar set for 90 minutes? And we never really got the chance to work that out. We sort of had ideas, but it never made it to the rehearsal room. So that's a question still unanswered for me, for all of us, but definitely, listening to, we were all surprised at how natural it fit, I think, listening to those first drafts of the audio work. And it definitely, I will say that since writing Loaded, the other little, many of the things that I've been working on have been, I suppose, character studies in a similar way. It was a really terrific way to go deep on a character. I don't think I often go that deep on all of my characters. Not all of my characters I ever hear from for 90 minutes. And that was a really interesting takeaway from this.
Yeah, great. And Andrew, you mentioned that this was, you described yourself as a raw screenwriter at this time. What did you learn about screenwriting from this adaptation that you took into your, stellar practice thereon?
Well, that it's incredibly hard. It's a much harder medium than you kind of think it is. That there are that it's quite a rigid form. It has certain kind of demands. We're coming from the theatre where there is such a sort of freedom of language and structure and space, which is kind of counterintuitive. You think a film can go anywhere, and it can in a way, but within a sort of predetermined form, where theatre is truly a more experimental kind of medium, I think. So, I learned how to sustain a story over a 90-minute period. How to write about a complex character, how to kind of externalize what is internal in the novel. That whole the amazing energy in Christos's prose. We couldn't, early versions of that film had a lot of voiceover, trying to retain that energy, trying to retain Christos's voice. We just had to keep losing that and find the cinematic equivalent of that imagery, which is, cinematic equivalent of that language and that energy, which is image and rhythm and pace and music and cinematography. So I was learning a lot about that at the time, but still probably finished the whole process feeling still quite raw as a screenwriter.
When a final question then, perhaps tapping into that for each of you, the same question. Something I noted in your speech last night, Andrew, that you said when your kind of about to encounter a new work, or you're wondering about what to write next, I'm paraphrasing you from memory here, that you ask yourself, what is the thing that is, what frightens you most, the thing that is frightening you most at the moment, and then you zero in and say, I'll write about that. And what frightened you most about this project from the writer's point of view?
Okay, so, you know, I hadn't learned to ask myself that question then. That's something that it's a test for me. Am I afraid of this? And if I am afraid of it, it's usually a good sign that I should go there. So because I think every bit of writing, every bit of art it requires an act of courage. Look, I think as a sort of Anglo-Saxon straight man, I had trepidation about stepping into that kind of terrain with confidence and authenticity. But then I reminded myself that I had the book, and the book was such an authentic document. So part of that process, just channel the author's voice, trust the author, because that is from whom this amazing voice came from. It didn't need to come from me. I just needed to arrange it in a way that was suitable to another medium, and also to meet a demanding director's expectations. So yeah, I guess what was I scared of about Ari? His defiance, his refusal to meet the obligations. Because I felt like I was so busy meeting everybody's expectations and obligations, and here's this guy that went, well, fuck you, I'm not going to meet any of it. And I was full of admiration for that, and it was kind of exhilarating, but also I was quite fearful of it.
I can imagine, yeah. Dan, what about you? You've talked about, I guess, it being intimidating. Was that the word you used to write with Christos? But independently of that, what frightened you about this project?
I suppose a similar thing about authenticity of voice and what I could add to this, particularly that, working with Christos, and it was it was my first main stage work, so it was on a really public scale. I guess I too was frightened of that character. That softened over. I suppose because my early sort of feelings about him were that he was a bit of a brat. Like, he is a bit of a brat, but that the more I read the novel and the more time I spent with him, I really fell in love with him, and I read and heard his youthfulness. I think you can read that book and he's so articulate, not necessarily emotionally articulate, but so he's got an opinion about everything. And I don't think I had an opinion about everything at 19 necessarily. I was still sort of finding myself a bit more, and I was frightened of how complex he was. But I suppose once I settled into the fact that he's 19, that really was the transformation for me. I softened towards him a lot.
And that you mentioned earlier, you said that you thought that Christos as a personality was a little thicker skinned, is probably the right word there, about wearing, owning some of the cultural identity stuff that you said you were a bit apprehensive about. How did that end up settling for you once the piece was in the public domain? What did you take away from the experience?
Well, I suppose we shared that a bit more. I guess I didn't feel the full burden of that, and I guess the things that I don't know. I never wrote things that were or the parts of Ari that Christos could speak to, Christos spoke to, and then the parts of Ari that I could speak to, I spoke to, I think.
Excellent. Well, look, hopefully that's not the end of Ari's ongoing life. Maybe we'll meet him again in another 20 years, and you can mentor the next generation, each of you, off screen and stage, and audio writers through a perpetual kind of adapting of that character as he's entered our canon, which is really a remarkable opportunity, I would imagine, for each of you, but a remarkable opportunity for us to be able to speak with two accomplished artists in your own rights, but also your contributions to this novel that has become, you know, and all of its texts have become, you know, canonical Australian works. So thank you very much, both of you. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Andrew Bovell.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you.
We'll say goodbye, and goodbye to our participants at home as well, and remind you that our next session is coming up very soon at 10:35, in fact, and we will be talking about adapting novels to the stage with Chris Hay. Thanks, everyone, and see you soon.